Get out! The bank manager humiliated the old man. But the truth about him changed everything. Mr. Arthur Harrison had arrived in that town with a single purpose: to resolve a problem that had gone unanswered for 2 years. He didn't tell his children, didn't warn anyone. He caught the early morning bus, the old leather suitcase that had been with him for decades, and came alone. That's when he walked through the bank's glass door and heard the manager say, pointing toward the exit in front of all the employees and customers who stopped what they were doing to watch, "Get out. This is no place for you." Arthur didn't back down. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at that man in his crisp suit with a calm that seemed out of place in such a tired body, and walked out slowly, without rush, without stooping. Outside, he sat on the wooden bench in the town square across from the branch, took off his worn hat, ran his knobby fingers through his completely white hair, and sat quietly for a while. The sun beat down hard on the square, pigeons walked around his dusty feet, and the old man watched the street bustle with an expression of someone who had lived too long to be undone by a humiliation. What he didn't know was that, from that day on, nothing would be the same. Not for him, not for the man who had sent him away, not for that branch that thought itself so above it all. The story that followed wasn't loud. It had no shouting or cinematic confrontations, but it was able to turn the lives of many people upside down and reveal a truth that no one within those marble walls had the courage to see. It all started weeks earlier, when Arthur Harrison tried to resolve the land deed issue by phone. There were almost 4 acres of fertile land in the countryside, inherited from his father, worked by him his entire life, and now needed to be legally transferred to his grandchildren's names, according to the family agreement that had been made with a local attorney. The process was simple on paper, but in practice there was an administrative hold-up that prevented the registration from going through, and the bank where the document was held had stopped responding to any communication 2 years ago. Arthur called 3 times, left a message, had his attorney, Attorney Samuel Vance, call as well. Samuel called, waited, called again. On one attempt, the attendant said the process was under review. On another, that it would be returned shortly. On the third, there was simply no record of the process in the system. Samuel asked for a deadline. No deadline came. He sent a letter with a return receipt. The letter was signed. The reply never came. That's when Arthur, on a Monday morning when he woke before the sun and lay staring at the slatted ceiling of his room, decided to go in person. He was 78 years old. His legs weren't what they used to be, and the nearly 4-hour bus ride left his body aching. But there was something in him that hadn't aged, a quiet determination that his wife called stubbornness, but that the neighbors called grit. Martha, the oldest daughter-in-law, tried to convince him to wait another month. "Dad, Attorney Samuel said he'd try again next week." "Attorney Samuel has tried enough," Arthur replied, carefully folding his sturdy denim shirt on the bed bench. "Now it's my turn to try." "You're going by bus? With that knee?" "The knee's coming along whether it likes it or not," he said, and went to fetch the suitcase from the top of the wardrobe. The leather suitcase was old, with a latch that didn't fasten properly anymore, and sides marked by time. "But Mr. Arthur opened it carefully and began placing inside, one by one, all the documents Attorney Samuel Vance had prepared over the months. Copies of the original land registry, the letter sent to the bank, the lawyer's protocol, the receipts for the phone calls noted with date and time, and a separate folder with the letters Mr. Arthur himself had handwritten to the branch manager, never answered. Martha stood still in the bedroom doorway, watching her father-in-law organize that material with the precision of someone who had been preparing this for a long time. There was an order to that briefcase that surprised her. Each document was in its place, separated by metal clips that Attorney Samuel had arranged to have put on, with small handwritten labels identifying the contents. This wasn't the disorganization of an old man. It was the archive of someone who had fought with method and patience for a long time. "Do you know how to get there?" "I know the street name. The rest I'll ask around." She didn't say anything else. She knew that tone. What Martha didn't tell her father-in-law that morning was that she herself had tried to call the bank the previous week, without him knowing. She had explained the situation to an attendant who promised to check. The next day, She called back and was told the process was under internal review and that a representative would get in touch. No contact ever came. Martha had kept that information to herself, not wanting to worry Mr. Arthur further, who had been sleeping poorly for weeks because of the matter. The next morning, Mr. Arthur woke up at 4:30, drank the coffee he had prepared the night before, put on his wide-brimmed hat, the same one he had worn at the regional markets for as long as he could remember, and walked to the bus stop while the town was still asleep. The early morning air was fresh, smelling of damp earth and grass. The stars were still in the sky when he reached the stop and sat on the concrete bench to wait. A young woman with a child in her arms was waiting at the same stop. She looked at him, at the briefcase, at the hat, and turned her eyes back to the sleeping child. Neither of them spoke. Sometimes shared silence with a stranger is the best company. The trip was long. The bus stopped at every small town along the way. Mr. Arthur gazed out the window at the prairie that gradually gave way to taller buildings, wider asphalt, busier traffic. He arrived around 10 in the morning, a bit stiff from the hard seat, but whole. He asked the taxi driver at the bus station how to get to the bank. The driver looked at the briefcase, at the hat, at the shirt torn at the elbows, and then at the address Mr. Arthur showed him on a folded piece of paper. "Are you sure it's this bank?" "I am," said Mr. Arthur, nothing more. The driver took him without asking further questions. Along the way, Mr. Arthur observed the city they passed through, wider streets than he was used to, buildings with more floors, shop windows with lights that flashed even in the daytime. A city that had grown a lot since the last time he had passed through it, perhaps 10 years ago when he came to an agricultural fair with his oldest son. His oldest son. He thought about him for a moment. George had moved to the West Coast 5 years ago with his wife and 2 children. He worked at a transportation company and called on Sundays. It was a life he had chosen and that Mr. Arthur respected, but it sometimes left a gap in the yard where the boy used to play soccer with his brothers. The other 2 sons still lived in the region, with families of their own. Martha was the wife of the middle one, Thomas, who took care of the larger part of the farm with his father. They were solid, hard-working people. But there was something the old man carried alone, the responsibility of ensuring that what he had built wouldn't be lost to bureaucracy, to negligence, to someone who decided it wasn't a priority. The branch was imposing. Glass and dark granite facade, 2 uniformed security guards at the entrance, and inside, that white marble floor reflecting the light from the fixtures with a clarity that seemed almost arrogant. There was a fair number of customers waiting in lines organized by electronic ticket numbers, and navy blue uniformed employees moving around with folders and papers. Arthur walked in slowly, scanning with his eyes for the ticket dispenser. He stood for a moment looking at the device without quite understanding how it worked. A young voice beside him said, "Can I help you, sir?" It was Sarah, one of the attendants, who had noticed the man standing at the entrance holding his briefcase, his gaze searching for some fixed point to orient himself. She was 29, hair pulled back, wearing the branch uniform she had learned to use as a second skin after 4 years there. She had the kind of awareness of her surroundings that isn't taught in training. It comes from character. Arthur turned to her with a restrained smile. "I need to speak to someone about a deed process that's been held up here for 2 years." Sarah asked him to take a ticket and wait to be called. He thanked her. She went back to the line but kept an eye on that quiet man who sat down in one of the waiting chairs, his briefcase on his lap, his hat on his head, and waited with a patience that few there showed. Sarah had learned over 4 years of working at the bank to read the atmosphere of a room the way others read the weather, by the signs. And there was something about that man that didn't match discomfort, even though he seemed out of place in that environment of marble and uniforms. He seemed to know exactly where he was and why he had come. At that very moment, on the opposite side of the room, the director, Julian Harrington, had just finished a meeting with a group of investors. Julian was 42, wearing a perfectly tailored grey suit, a gold watch on his left wrist, his dark hair gelled back. He was the kind of man who walked into any room and immediately sought control of it. He had come to that branch 3 years earlier from a branch in the capital with a track record of meeting targets and a reputation for not wasting time on anything he called service without return. There was something in Julian's background that explained, but didn't justify, this philosophy. He grew up in a middle-class family that had lost almost everything when he was 12. His father had been unemployed for 2 years, the house had been sold, and the silent humiliations of needing to ask for favors to survive had marked that boy in a way he never discussed with anyone. As an adult, he built around himself an armor made of efficiency, results, and appearances. He genuinely believed that people with no significant financial activity weren't the responsibility of a serious banking institution. It was a belief born from an old fear, and over the years had turned into policy. It was precisely this philosophy that caused something inside Julian Harrington to set off an invisible alarm when he saw Arthur in the waiting line. The old man didn't match the profile Julian had mentally built for the ideal clientele of that branch. He crossed the room with long strides, stopped in front of the chair where Arthur was sitting, and said loudly enough for everyone around to hear, "Do you have an account here?" Arthur looked at him calmly. "No, I don't have an account here, but I need to resolve a matter." "What kind of matter?" "A deed that's been held up. I have documents here explaining everything." Julian looked at the old briefcase, then at the hat, then at the shirt with the worn elbows. "Listen, this kind of issue needs to be handled by a lawyer or the legal department. This isn't the right place." "My lawyer already handled it. They've called, they've sent letters, we got no response." Julian took a step back, crossed his arms and said, in a voice that no longer even pretended to be cordial, "Then you need to schedule an appointment with formal documentation by registered letter, so your request can be reviewed through the proper process. The way you showed up here, without notice, without an account at this institution, there's nothing I can do." "I have all the documents here," said Mr. Arthur, opening his briefcase slightly. That's when Julian took the step that would change everything. He walked to the entrance door, opened it with a wide gesture, and facing the entire hall, employees, customers, security guards, extended his arm and pointed his finger outside. "Get out, this place isn't for you." The silence that fell over the branch was the kind that weighs heavy. The keys stopped clicking. The voices of conversations vanished. Even the air seemed to stop. Sarah, at the teller window, felt her stomach tighten. An older woman in the waiting line pressed her lips together. A younger employee lowered his eyes to the desk, unsure where to place the discomfort he felt. There were at least 20 people in that hall at that moment, and they all froze. Mr. Arthur stood still for a second, looking at Julian, not with anger, with that calm that is harder to hold on to than any yell. Then he put his briefcase under his arm, stood up slowly like someone who has all the time in the world, and walked to the door. Before leaving, he paused for a fraction of a second but said nothing. He just walked away. Outside, he sat on the wooden bench in the town square, took off his hat, and stayed quiet. Sarah watched him through the teller window with a tightness in her chest she couldn't name. Julian had already gone back to the glass-walled office, pleased with himself, as if he had resolved something. No one dared to comment aloud, but the glances crossing the hall said what mouths could not. There was a customer who had witnessed everything, a lady about 65, with a printed fabric bag and the posture of someone who doesn't swallow rudeness easily. When Julian passed her on his way back to the office, she said, without raising her voice much, just enough for those nearby to hear, "What a shame." Julian didn't answer. He went on as if he hadn't heard. The lady stared at the glass door through which the old man had left, then looked at Sarah as if she were waiting for something. Sarah lowered her eyes. The lady took a number, waited to be called, did what she had to do, and left. But before leaving, she stopped at the door and looked again at the bench in the square outside. The old man was still sitting there. Inside herself, Sarah stamped the document in front of her, but her mind was outside, on that old man sitting on the town square bench with his briefcase on his lap and his hat in his hand. 40 minutes later, when it was time for her break, she did something that surprised even herself. She grabbed her bag, went out the side door, crossed the square, and stopped in front of the bench where Mr. Arthur was still sitting. "Excuse me, sir. You're still here?" Mr. Arthur looked up. His eyes were dark, a little sunken with age but alive in a way that few eyes of younger people can be. "Yes, I am. I'm waiting for the next bus. It only comes in 2 hours." Sarah sat on the bench next to him. It was the sort of thing she would never do in a normal situation, but there was something about that scene that simply wouldn't let her go. "I saw what happened inside," she said carefully. "I'm sorry for what you went through." "No need to apologize for what you didn't do," he replied with no bitterness in his tone. "Did you come from far away?" "I did. I left at dawn." Sarah looked at the briefcase. "You mentioned a deed. May I ask what it's about?" Mr. Arthur looked at her for a moment, as if assessing whether it was worth it. Then he said, "I have land in the countryside. Inheritance from my father. I worked that land my whole life, raised my children on it. Now I want to get the transfer to my grandchildren settled before I get any older. The bank here has a registered document that's holding things up. I've tried to sort it out by phone, by letter, through a lawyer. No one answers." "And was that document deposited here voluntarily?" "It was, but because of a credit application I took out years ago that's been fully paid off. When I paid it off, I asked for the deed back. They told me the cancellation would be processed. It never was. 2 years ago we noticed the mistake when the lawyer went to check the property registry." Sarah was quiet for a moment. She knew from hearsay that there were cases stuck at the branch, but she'd never really understood what that meant in practice for the people on the other side. "Do you have the documents proving the payment?" "I have everything right here," he said, tapping his briefcase lightly. Sarah thought for a moment. "Let me see what I can find out inside. Can you wait here for me?" "I can. I've got nowhere to go before the bus." She went back into the branch, but instead of heading straight to the counter, she walked over to the administrative section and asked to speak with the customer service supervisor, Mrs. Brenda, a woman with dyed brown hair and round glasses who had worked there for 18 years. Mrs. Brenda was the kind of employee who knew what was happening in every corner of the place, not out of nosiness, but because she'd been there long enough to understand how the branch's internal machinery worked. Sarah explained the situation in a low voice, without mentioning the manager's name. She just described the case. An elderly man with a deed held up for 2 years, a paid-off loan, all the paperwork in hand, who had tried every avenue and gotten no response. Mrs. Brenda listened with growing attention. "What's his name?" "Mr. Arthur Harrison." Mrs. Brenda went to the computer, typed in the name, and waited. The screen loaded. She looked at the result with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read at first, a mix of recognition and something like discomfort. "This case here," Mrs. Brenda began and stopped. "What about it? It's been marked as under administrative review for 26 months. 26 months? Sarah stared at her. The marking was done right after a change in the case system that the manager Julian implemented when he arrived. Several similar cases were grouped into a special review queue that, she hesitated, that never actually got reviewed. The silence between them lasted longer than necessary. "Brenda, what does that mean in practice?" "In practice, it means Mr. Arthur's case is stalled with no real justification, and there are probably others in the same situation." Sarah felt her stomach tighten again. "Is there anything I can do right now?" Mrs. Brenda looked at the screen, then at Sarah, then back at the screen. "Not while the manager is here. Any movement in that special queue needs his authorization. And you know how he is." Sarah knew. Everyone knew. A week ago, she'd tried to ask a simple question about updating an elderly customer's registration, and Julian had responded with an impatience that felt more like contempt than haste. "But tomorrow the regional management is visiting," Mrs. Brenda said, lowering her voice even more. "Dr. Eleanor is coming for a routine inspection. If you can find a way to get the case to her before it goes through Julian—" She let the sentence hang in the air. Sarah left the administrative section with her head spinning. She went back to the town square where Mr. Arthur was still sitting, watching the pigeons on the sidewalk. "Mr. Arthur," she said, sitting down again, "I found out a few things. Your case is in the system, but it's held up by an internal issue that I can't resolve right now." He looked at her closely. "But tomorrow there's an important visit at the branch." Someone with authority to sort this out. Can you come back early tomorrow?" Mr. Arthur was quiet for a moment. "Can I sleep at a cheap hotel nearby? There's a boarding house on the street next to the town square." "Mrs. Maggie charges little and it's clean." "Then I'll stay," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Sarah wrote the address of the boarding house and the time the branch opened on the back of a piece of paper. "Show up before 7:30 if you can. I'll be there." Mr. Arthur folded the paper, put it in his shirt pocket and extended his hand. "What's your name, young lady?" "Sarah." "Thank you, Sarah. You're the first person who listened to me today." She shook his hand and left quickly, because she knew she would cry if she stayed another second. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. That really helps us beginners. Now, continuing. That night, Mr. Arthur lay in the simple room of the boarding house with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The mattress was too soft for someone used to the one at home, but that wasn't what kept him awake. He thought about the land. He thought about his grandchildren, Leo and Grace, who were still children but would one day need those roots. His father's land had been work, sacrifice, getting up before sunrise and going to bed after dark. It had been years of cracked fields, of heart-wrenching drought, of harvests that didn't always pay off what they promised. But it had also been a full table, the sound of children playing in the backyards, the smell of wet soil when the rain finally came. Mr. Arthur had promised his father, one afternoon when the old man was too weak to go to the fields, that he would take care of it, that he would pass it on, that no bank bureaucrat would be stronger than that promise. He also thought about his wife, Dot, Dorothy, as it was on the official record, but no one in life had ever called her that. Dot had passed away 6 years ago from something that started in her lung and went fast. Her last months were spent at home, with their children taking turns caring for her, with Mr. Arthur sleeping in a chair by her bed when she didn't want to be alone at night. She had said, in one of their last lucid conversations, "Arthur, take care of the land. The land is what remains." He had promised her he would. Thinking about that, he closed his eyes and fell asleep. At the branch, Julian Harrington stayed late reviewing reports. He didn't think once about the old man from the town square. For him, the matter was closed. He had protected the branch's image from unproductive service, as he called any interaction with people who, in his judgment, brought no real financial return. He had targets to meet, investors to attend to, and a position that had cost years of concessions and strategies to achieve. The gold watch on his wrist read almost 10 at night when he turned off the light in the glass-walled office and left. He crossed the empty lobby, gave a slight nod to the security guard at the entrance, and walked out without looking back. Outside, the town square was quiet. The wooden bench where Mr. Arthur had sat was empty. Julian didn't look at it. The next morning at 7:15, Sarah arrived at the branch before everyone else, except for the security guard at the entrance and Mrs. Brenda, who had a habit of always arriving early. The two exchanged discreet glances. Neither needed to say anything. At 7:22, Mr. Arthur walked through the door, still closed to the public, which Sarah opened personally for him. He was wearing the same hat, the same shirt, the same briefcase. He seemed to have slept well, which surprised Sarah. She had slept poorly, tossing and turning in bed, worried about what might or might not work out that morning. "Good morning, Sarah." "Good morning, Mr. Arthur. Dr. Eleanor arrives around 8. Then we'll wait." He went to sit in a chair near the entrance. Mrs. Brenda brought a coffee, without saying anything special, just placed the cup in the old man's hand with a nod. He thanked her. Mrs. Brenda looked at him for a second longer than necessary, then left without a word. At 10:08, a dark car parked in front of the branch. Dr. Eleanor Sterling got out with a black briefcase under her arm and the thick-lensed glasses she had worn since she was 40. She was 57, with short grey hair, and a way of walking that conveyed purpose without arrogance. She had been a regional manager 6 years ago, had visited dozens of branches, and had the kind of eye that saw what wasn't written in the reports. She entered through the main door, greeted Sarah with a nod, and when her eyes swept the empty room and landed on the man sitting in the chair near the entrance, she stopped. She stood still for about 3 seconds that felt much longer. Then she walked quickly over to him and said, in a voice that mixed surprise with respect, "Mr. Arthur." The old man looked up and smiled. "Eleanor, you got old too. You've known me for 40 years, sir. You can't complain." She pulled up the chair next to him and sat down, completely ignoring the protocol of a formal introduction she should have made at the door. "What are you doing here?" "I came to sort out a deed issue. Only yesterday they sent me away before I could talk to anyone." Eleanor's expression shifted subtly, but Sarah, who was a few feet away pretending to organize papers, clearly noticed. "Sent you away how?" Arthur told the story, without drama, without exaggeration, just the facts, in the order they happened. The manager's voice in the middle of the hall, the finger pointed at the door, the silence of the employees. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. There was a restraint in her that was professional, the kind of anger that turns into determination before it reaches the face. "Who was it?" "I don't know the name. A man about 40, grey suit, gold watch, suit." "Julian," she said, more to herself than to him. At that moment, Julian Harrington arrived at the branch with the step of someone expecting nothing different from that morning. He wore a navy blue suit, different from yesterday's, with the same posture as always. He opened the door with the magnetic card and walked in talking on his cell phone. When he saw Eleanor sitting next to a man in a hat in the waiting area, he stopped mid-sentence. "Dr. Eleanor, good morning," he said, ending the call. "I didn't know you'd arrive so early." "Good morning, Julian." Her voice was calm, but not warm. "We need to talk, but first I want you to tell me what happened here yesterday." Julian looked at the old man. It took him a second to recognize the face, and when he did, he felt something shift inside his chest, but he couldn't yet identify what. "There was an incident with a visitor who didn't have an appointment and—" "Julian," Eleanor interrupted him gently but firmly, "I've known Mr. Arthur Harrison for 4 decades. But that's not why we're talking. We're talking because what you did yesterday, regardless of who that person was a public humiliation inside a branch that represents this institution. And I need you to understand the gravity of that." The hall had begun to fill with employees arriving for work. Some discreetly stopped to watch the scene. Julian realized they were being observed and felt the heat rise up his neck. "Dr. Eleanor, I can explain." "You will explain, yes. But in the meeting room with all the documentation for Mr. Arthur's case on the table. In 20 minutes. Julian nodded, turned, and headed to the glass-walled room. But his step was no longer the same as before. The meeting started at 8:40. Eleanor asked Sarah to pull up Mr. Arthur Harrison's case file from the system and print the complete version. She also asked Mrs. Brenda to be present, as the employee with the most seniority and knowledge of internal processes. Arthur sat at the head of the table with his briefcase open in front of him, the documents organized by date, in an order that showed years of care. Julian sat on the other side, his posture slightly less upright than usual. Eleanor analyzed the printed file in silence for a few minutes. "Julian, how long ago was the credit tied to this deed paid off?" "I'd need to check." "It's right here. Paid off 4 years and 3 months ago. The request to release the deed was filed by Mr. Arthur's attorney 2 years and 7 months ago. Why is it still under review?" There was a restructuring in the case processing system. Some cases ended up in a waiting queue while the new protocol was being implemented. 2 years and 7 months. Is that protocol implementation or case abandonment? Julian didn't answer immediately. Mrs. Brenda, who had been quietly sitting in a corner of the table, spoke with a controlled voice. "Dr. Eleanor, Mr. Arthur's case isn't the only one in this situation. When the new protocol was introduced, a specific queue was created for cases that the director classified as low priority. That queue currently has 127 cases. The number landed in the room like a stone. Eleanor took off her glasses, wiped the lenses with a corner of her jacket and looked back at them. 127. Yes. I checked last night after Sarah told me about Mr. Arthur. Eleanor turned to Julian. What criteria were used to classify these cases as low priority? There was a pause that lasted too long. They were cases with straightforward documentation, no active account activity, mostly from clients in the countryside. Mostly from clients in the countryside, Eleanor repeated slowly, as if making sure she had heard correctly. Arthur remained quiet throughout this exchange. His hands were clasped on the table, his eyes moving across the faces around him with an attention that wasn't judgment. It was observation. He had lived long enough to know that sometimes silence is the most powerful argument. Every word he didn't speak now weighed more than any speech he could have made. It was Julian who broke the ensuing silence. "Doctor, the goals of this branch required us to prioritize clients with higher financial activity. This is in line with the corporate guidelines for—" "The corporate guidelines," Eleanor said, opening the folder she had brought, "do not include anywhere the instruction to ignore a legitimate case from a client who fully paid off his obligations and formally requested the regularization of his document for 2 years and 7 months. What's written here," she pointed at the report, "is case abandonment, which constitutes a serious administrative failure." Julian stared at the table. "I'd like to see the internal emails and records that justify this low-priority classification. I'd need to check the files. You have until the end of this meeting." Julian left the room to get the files. When the door closed, Eleanor turned to Arthur. "Mr. Arthur, I need you to forgive me for what happened yesterday." "Already forgiven," he said, without hesitation. "But I didn't come here to ask for forgiveness. I came to ask for what is rightfully mine." "And you'll have it," she said firmly. "By the end of this week, your case will be resolved. You have my word." "Eleanor Sterling's word has always been gold," said the old man, with a smile that was almost a secret. There was in that smile the memory of an earlier time, when Eleanor was in her mid-20s and learning in the offices of Mr. Arthur Harrison's cooperative what no book had taught her about dealing with people. "Can I ask you something, Eleanor?" "Go ahead." "You went far, the way I expected you would." He paused. "Was the cooperative a good school?" She looked at him for a moment. "The best I ever had." Another pause. "That's where I learned that a person's worth doesn't fit on a registration card." Mr. Arthur nodded, as if that confirmed something he already knew. When Julian came back with a laptop under his arm and looking slightly paler than when he had left, he sat down again and opened the files. Eleanor carefully scrutinized the emails for several minutes. What she found wasn't the kind of thing that gets exposed in a single meeting, but enough to confirm what she had already suspected. The low-priority queue had been created by a unilateral decision of the director without authorization from regional management, and several of the cases included were from people who had tried to make contact without receiving a response. There was one particular email that made her stop. It was a message from Julian to the case coordinator. "These cases don't represent significant financial volume. Keep them in the special queue until further notice." The date was from 2.5 years ago. The further notice had never come. "Julian, I'm going to need you to be available for an internal audit in the coming days. Until it's concluded, your decisions at this branch will need to go through my direct approval." It was the equivalent of a veiled suspension. Everyone in the room understood. Julian nodded without saying a word. Sarah, who had stayed outside the meeting but was called in from time to time to bring documents, caught fragments of conversation through the door and felt something strange. Not exactly relief, because the situation was too serious for that, but something like the feeling that the air had gotten a little cleaner. When the meeting ended, Mr. Arthur left the room with his briefcase closed and his hat back on his head. Sarah met him in the hallway. "So?" she asked cautiously. "It'll be resolved," he said. "Doctor, Eleanor is serious. Do you know her from before?" Mr. Arthur hesitated for a second. "She was an intern at a farmers' cooperative I chaired many years ago, a smart young woman. I knew she'd go far." Sarah stared at him with a different expression than before. "You chaired a cooperative?" "I used to. I've done a lot of things. Now all I want is for my grandchildren to have what's theirs." He said this with a naturalness that left no room for more questions. He picked up his briefcase, nodded, and headed for the exit. "Mr. Arthur," Sarah called out. He stopped. "Thank you for coming back." He smiled. It was a smile that reached his eyes, the kind you can't learn, that only comes from having lived a lot. "It's you I have to thank. You were the only one who listened to me when everyone else looked the other way." He left. Sarah stood in the hallway for a time she couldn't measure. In the following days, the branch experienced a different kind of tension than usual. Julian was still present, but his presence had changed in nature. He no longer set the pace of things, no longer strode through the hall with that step of someone who knows the space belongs to him. He stayed in the glass-walled office, with the door almost always closed, answering the audit emails that Eleanor had started. The employees noticed the change. No one commented openly, but the looks said what mouths did not. There was a colleague of Sarah's, Victoria, who had worked directly with Julian for 2 years on the service coordination team. Victoria walked over to Sarah one afternoon while the two were organizing documents in the archives and said in a very low voice, "I knew about some of the stalled cases. I tried to talk to him about it twice. He said it was a matter of technical priority and that I didn't understand administrative processes." Sarah looked at her. "And you believed him?" "Not entirely. But what was I going to do?" Victoria paused. "You did what I didn't have the courage to do. I just went and talked to an old man in the town square. Yeah, sometimes that's what's missing." Mrs. Brenda continued her routine with the same efficiency as always, but there was something lighter in the way she now communicated with the team, as if a weight she had carried in silence for months had finally been set down. Sarah, for her part, found herself thinking a lot about Mr. Arthur, not just about him, but about what he represented. The kind of person the system had learned to ignore because he didn't fit the criteria someone had decided defined value. She thought about the other 126 cases in the low-priority queue and imagined the faces behind them. Not abstract faces, but people like the old man in the hat, with stories and promises and pieces of life waiting to be regularized by a stamp that never came. One afternoon, between the end of one appointment and the start of the next, she excused herself to Mrs. Brenda and went to check the system for some of the other cases in the queue. What she found confirmed what she feared. There were cases even older than Mr. Arthur's. An elderly woman named Martha, 81 years old, with an apartment inherited from her sister, whose registration had been held up for 3 years and 4 months. A couple of farmers, the Fletchers, who had paid off a loan for equipment purchases and had been waiting for the release of the property given as collateral for 2 years and 11 months. A retired man named Mr. Alistair, whose life savings were tied up in a case that had simply vanished from the radar. Sarah went to Mrs. Brenda with this information and found her already holding a list of her own. "I know," Mrs. Brenda said in a low voice. "I already sent it to Dr. Eleanor this morning. Are you okay?" Brenda looked at her for a second. "I should have done this before. I knew that queue was wrong. There was no way not to know. But Julian was the branch manager and I—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "Brenda, you didn't do that. You just didn't undo it." "Sometimes not undoing is almost the same thing, Sarah." It was one of the most honest statements Sarah had heard within those walls, and there was no easy answer to it, because it was true, and they both knew it. That same week, Eleanor coordinated the formal opening of an internal review of all 127 cases in the queue. A team of 3 people was sent from the regional management to assist. The affected families were contacted by letter and by phone. For each case, an explanation and a concrete resolution deadline were sent. The responses that came back from those families were not all gratitude. There was anger, too, the righteous anger of those who had waited years for something that should have been simple. There was silence from those who had given up waiting and taken other harder paths. There was crying from an elderly woman who had sold part of a property because she needed the money and couldn't regularize the original deed to negotiate properly, and who only now understood that she wouldn't have had to make that sacrifice if the case had been handled in time. Sarah followed part of these communications and felt each one in a different way. While all this was happening inside the branch, there was something going on outside that Eleanor discovered during the audit, and that added an even heavier layer to the situation. While reviewing the branch's external communication records, the team identified a correspondence between the bank and a local real estate company called Prime Prop Estates. Over the past 2 years, the company had requested appraisals for 23 properties whose owners had cases stalled in the low-priority queue. The request had been handled informally, with no formal partnership registration, no proper documentation, and no communication whatsoever to the owners of the appraised properties. Eleanor stared at that report for a long time before calling the institution's legal representative. The logic was troubling. While families waited without answers, unable to sell, rent, or transfer their properties due to the lack of regularization, Prime Prop Estates was collecting appraisals. If any of those families in desperation decided to sell below market value, Prime Prop Estates would be perfectly positioned to make an offer. Nothing had been formally recorded to prove that the scheme had been coordinated between Julian and Prime Prop Estates. But there were too many specific coincidences to be accidental, and the lack of documentation itself was an answer. Julian, faced with this point in a second meeting with Eleanor and the legal representative, said the partnership had been informal and that there had been no intention to harm the property owners. He claimed he saw the partnership as a way to streamline appraisals for cases that were being resumed. Eleanor listened patiently. Julian, the cases were not being resumed. They were stalled. By your decision. He didn't respond. Eleanor went personally to the Prime Prop Estates office, accompanied by the legal representative, and formally ended the partnership with termination documentation duly recorded. The owner of Prime Prop Estates, a man named David Vance, accepted the termination without public resistance, but with a silence that said more than any protest. When the final report reached Eleanor's desk, she read it 3 times before making the call she had to make to the institution's board of directors. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. The next day, Julian Harrington was formally notified of his dismissal. It wasn't a noisy firing. There was no public scandal. Everything was handled within administrative channels. But his personnel record was compromised in a way that would close doors for a long time. Julian left the branch at the end of an afternoon on a Thursday, carrying a box with his personal belongings from the glass-walled office. The gold watch on his wrist caught the light from the ceiling fixtures as he crossed the lobby for the last time. The employees who were present kept doing what they were doing. No one wished him luck. No one was mean-spirited either. He just crossed the lobby and disappeared through the glass door. Sarah was at the counter when it happened. She saw the scene from a distance out of the corner of her eye. She felt something that wasn't satisfaction. It was closer to sadness, the kind that doesn't come from pity, but from the awareness that all of it had been unnecessary. That 127 families had been harmed. That an old man had taken a 4-hour trip in the early morning only to be turned away at the door. That everything could have been avoided if someone inside that branch had looked at what was really happening. But there was also something else, the realization that, when someone finally did look, the balance tipped. That night, Sarah went to have dinner at her mother's house, as she did every Thursday. Her mother, Mrs. Irene, was 68 years old, lived alone since her husband had retired, and gone to his brother's town to take care of a piece of land, and loved having her daughter over for the weekly dinner. She made pot roast with carrots and mashed potatoes, the same things as always, with a flavor Sarah couldn't find anywhere else. As they ate, Sarah told her mother what had happened during the week. Mrs. Irene listened without interrupting, with that maternal attention that seems complete even when her hand is peeling a tomato. "That old man," Mrs. Irene said when her daughter finished. "What's his name?" "Arthur Harrison. And he took an overnight bus to sort out a deed." "He did. At 78 years old. Yes." Mrs. Irene was quiet for a moment, looking at her plate. "You know what that reminds me of?" "What?" "It reminds me of your grandfather, when he went to the city to sort out the house registration. All alone by train with that suitcase everyone laughed at because it was old. It took him 3 trips, and he got it done." Sarah stared at her mother. "I don't remember that." "You were little, but I remember it." Mrs. Irene paused. "These people, Sarah, they carry the world on their shoulders without complaining, and when someone shows up to help, it's like, like they can finally breathe. Sarah thought about the moment Arthur had heard that the process was ready, about the different breath she'd noticed on the other end of the phone. "I think that's exactly it," she said. Mrs. Irene got up to get more beans and said over her shoulder, "You did the right thing, my dear. Not everyone would have gone after him." Sarah stared at the table for a second. "I almost didn't go." "But you did." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us beginners. Now continuing. Mr. Arthur's case was the first one concluded. On the Friday of the same week he'd been sent away from the door, the document was finalized, signed, stamped, and ready. Sarah called the number he'd left, the landline at his daughter-in-law Martha Harrison's house. A young voice answered and said it was Grace, the youngest granddaughter. "Grace, I need to speak to your grandfather. Grandpa Arthur is in the backyard. Let me call him." There were sounds of a lively house in the background. Voices, a dog barking in the distance, a radio playing something Sarah didn't recognize, then slow footsteps approaching. "Hello." "Mr. Arthur, it's Sarah from the bank." A pause. "Sarah, how nice to hear from you. Mr. Arthur, the document is ready. The process has been finalized. You can come pick it up whenever you want, or if you prefer, Attorney Samuel Vance can come pick it up with a power of attorney." Another silence, longer this time. "Is it really ready?" "It is. I checked 3 times. His breathing was audible on the other end. There were no words for 2 or 3 seconds. "Miss," he said finally, with a voice slightly different than usual, as if something inside him had loosened. "I needed this news to come so badly." Sarah gripped the phone tighter than necessary. "I know, Mr. Arthur. I'm glad it came. I'll send Samuel to pick it up on Monday if that's possible." "You can send him. I'll set it aside for him." "Sarah." "Yes? Thank you, truly." She couldn't bring herself to say it was nothing. She just said yes, that it had been a pleasure, and hung up. Then she stared at the phone for a moment before putting it back on the cradle. Mrs. Brenda, who had passed by at that moment, asked with her eyes without using words, "It was Mr. Arthur, letting me know he'll send the attorney on Monday." Brenda nodded. There was something in the corners of her eyes that wasn't quite tears, but was from the same family. That afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected phone call. Unknown number, a hesitant female voice. "Is this Sarah, from the bank?" "That's me." "Who's speaking?" "My name is Martha Thompson. You contacted me last week about a deed process." Sarah recognized the name. It was one of the families in the low-priority queue, the 81-year-old woman with the apartment, inherited from her sister. "Mrs. Martha, yes, thank you for calling back. Did you receive the letter we sent?" "I did, yes, that's why I'm calling." A pause. "Miss, I was giving up. I had already called my son to talk about selling the apartment because I thought I would never be able to get it legalized. I even had it appraised by a real estate agency that reached out to me." Sarah stayed quiet. "Prime Prop Estates?" "That very one. They came to my house, valued the property, said they could buy it for a good price. I almost accepted, but my daughter told me to wait a little longer. Then your letter arrived." "Mrs. Martha, thank goodness your daughter asked you to wait. Your case will be regularized. The deed will be issued within the time frame we indicated in the letter." The older woman's voice on the other end trembled slightly. "I just want the apartment to go to my grandson. It was my sister's who didn't have children. She gave it to me because she knew I would take care of it. I really needed this to work out." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "It will work out, Mrs. Martha. I personally promise." When she hung up, Sarah went to the bathroom, closed the door, and stood in front of the mirror for about 2 minutes. She didn't cry, but she kept looking at herself as if she needed to somehow capture that moment. Mrs. Martha had almost sold what she inherited from her sister. The apartment that was a story, a memory, a promise, had nearly slipped away because of a stamp that depended on someone who had decided that case wasn't a priority. Sarah returned to her window. She served the next clients with full attention. When lunchtime came, instead of going to the usual snack bar, she stayed at the branch and checked 5 more cases from the queue. taking careful notes to ensure that contacts with the families were being made on time. Mrs. Brenda passed by her and looked at the stack of notes. "You're not going to lunch?" "Later." "Sarah." "I know. I'll eat lunch." Brenda placed a sandwich wrapped in parchment paper on her desk. "I brought two. It's easier to work with something in your stomach." Sarah looked at the sandwich, then at Brenda. "Thank you." "Thank you," said the older woman without further explanation, and walked away. The new interim management, appointed by Eleanor while a permanent name was being evaluated, was a woman named Christiane, 48 years old, who had coordinated another branch of the network for 6 years with a clean record and a management philosophy that Eleanor had personally verified before recommending her. Christiane arrived in the second week, was introduced to the team in a short, objective meeting, and soon made it clear that she liked an open door, both literally and metaphorically. It was one afternoon during Christiane's first week that she called Sarah and Mrs. Brenda into a quick meeting in the new management office. "I reviewed the training program that Dr. Eleanor passed on to me," she said, placing a folder on the table. "And I want you two to help build the module on ethical service and identifying systemic issues, not as listeners, as contributors." Mrs. Brenda looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Christiane. "Why us?" asked Brenda. "Because you were the ones who saw and acted, and because knowledge that isn't shared doesn't become culture. I want what happened here, both the mistake and the correction, to be part of how this branch trains its team going forward." Brenda nodded slowly. It was the kind of nod that carries more than agreement. "We're in," she said. The following week, Eleanor also called Sarah for a private conversation. "Sarah, there's something I want to tell you outside the team context. Go ahead. I'm going to include you in a management training program. It's not a reward for what you did. It's recognition of who you are." She paused. "You have a quality that is rarer than most training can teach. You see people before you see processes. That makes a difference in a leadership role." Sarah stayed quiet for a moment. "I still have a lot to learn. You do. Everyone does. But you already have the hardest part down." Eleanor stood up. "Think about what I told you." Sarah thought about it. And it was with that thought on her mind that she returned to her teller window and served the next customer with a newfound attention, not just professional, but aware of the weight of what she was doing. Outside the branch, in those same days, Mr. Arthur's life continued at its usual pace, the pace of the countryside, which doesn't wait for human bureaucracy, but obeys the rain, the sun, and the soil. When the deed reached Attorney Samuel Vance's hands and, days later, his own, Arthur didn't celebrate. That wasn't his way. He took the document inside, showed it to Martha, who read and reread it as if she needed to see it with her own eyes to be sure, and then he went to the far end of the backyard where the grandchildren were playing. Leo was 12 and Grace was 8. They were chasing the old dog named Blackie, who ran slower than they did so as not to embarrass them. "Leo," the grandfather called. The boy stopped and ran over to him. "Grandpa." Arthur knelt slowly, since his knees no longer bent without complaint, and came down to his grandson's level. "Do you know that this land where we live belonged to your great-grandfather?" "I know. You always tell me." "That's right. And now it will be in your name and your sister's when the right time comes." He put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "No matter what happens, the land is yours." Leo looked at his grandfather with the seriousness that sometimes appears on children's faces when they realize they're in an adult conversation. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I just solved a problem that took me 2 years of trying. And because you need to know that sometimes things take time, but if you don't give up, they come." The boy was quiet for a moment. "Did it cost a lot, Grandpa?" "It cost a bus ticket, one night at a boarding house, and being sent away by a man in a suit who judged me by my shirt." Leo narrowed his eyes. "He sent you away?" "He tried. But I came back." The grandson looked at his grandfather for a time that felt long for a 12-year-old child. "You're stubborn. Your grandma always said that." Arthur stood up with effort, lightly tapped his grandson's head with the palm of his hand. "Go play." And he went back inside where the deed lay folded on the living room table, waiting to be put away in its proper place. Martha, who had overheard part of the conversation through the kitchen window, looked at her father-in-law with a tight feeling in her chest that wasn't sadness. It was the kind of feeling you get when you realize you were part of something much bigger than it seemed. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, she sat next to her father-in-law on the porch with 2 glasses of homemade lemonade she had made with fruit from the backyard. "Dad," she said, using the title she had adopted many years ago, "did you know it was going to work out?" Arthur stared out into the dark yard for a moment. "I didn't know. But I knew going was the only thing I hadn't tried yet. And if it hadn't worked out, then I would have tried something else." Martha smiled into the dark. "You never give up. The soil doesn't give up bearing fruit because of a drought." He took a sip of the lemonade. "I learned that from it." They sat in silence for a while. The sound of crickets filled the night. In the distance, a neighbor's dog barked twice and stopped. "You know what stuck with me most from that trip?" Arthur said after a while. "What?" "The girl at the bank, Sarah." He paused. "She didn't have to come out to talk to me in the town square. It wasn't her job, but she did." "And why do you think she did?" Arthur was quiet for a moment. "I think she hadn't yet learned that people aren't worth the price of their clothes." Martha looked at him. "And the man who sent you away, what do you think of him?" "I think he learned the hard way something he could have learned for free much earlier." She didn't ask anything else. There was something Mr. Arthur hadn't told anyone. Not even Martha, not even the children. The night he stayed at the boarding house before falling asleep, he pulled from his shirt pocket a small photo, faded by time, of a young woman smiling in front of a peach tree. It was Dot, about 35 years old, on a sunny Sunday from a year he could no longer recall. He stared at that photo for a while. "Dot," he said softly, in a voice meant for no one to hear, "I'll make sure what we built is secure. You can count on it." Then he folded the photo back, put it in his pocket, turned off the light and went to sleep. It was the kind of thing you don't tell. But it explains a lot. 2 weeks after all that, when the branch had found a new rhythm and the audit process had reached its final stage, Sarah came to work on a Thursday morning and found on the counter a small envelope, no return address, with her name written on the front in handwriting that was clearly from someone who had learned to write back when penmanship was taught with care. She opened it carefully. Inside, a note folded in 4, written on lined notebook paper. "Sarah, you were the first person who saw me when no one else wanted to look. Don't forget that. What you did wasn't small. With gratitude, Mr. Arthur Harrison." She read it twice. Then she folded the note back, exactly as it had come, and placed it in the drawer with her personal belongings. Mrs. Brenda, who had seen the scene from afar, approached. "Was it from Mr. Arthur?" "It was." "What did he say?" Sarah closed the drawer. "Not to forget." Brenda was quiet for a second. "Good advice." They went back to work. The hall was filling up with the first customers of the morning. The light from the fixtures hit the white marble floor with that familiar clarity. But there was something different about that space. Not in the furniture, not in the walls, not in the navy blue uniforms. It was something harder to put into words, the kind you only feel when a place that had been working wrong for a long time begins, slowly, to right itself. Not that everything was resolved. It never is. The 127 families were at different stages of resolution. Some had received their documents, others were still waiting in the reorganized line. But now, with real deadlines and a working communication channel, there were mistakes to correct that would take months. There was trust to rebuild that would take even longer. But there was also Sarah at the counter, serving the first customer of the morning with full attention. There was Mrs. Brenda organizing the day with that 18-year efficiency that now had a clearer purpose. There was Christiane with the door open, the reports on the screen, and the willingness to hear what the team had to say. And there was, kept in a drawer, a note folded on notebook paper, with handwriting from someone who had learned to write with care, and who had crossed the city by bus before sunrise, with an old briefcase and an ancient promise to prove that truth eventually finds its way, even when someone tries to shut the door. Outside, a few hours away, in a backyard that smelled of earth and ripe fruit, Mr. Arthur Harrison woke up early as always had his coffee as always, and went to check on the crops as always. The worn-out hat on his head, his steps a little slower than 20 years ago, but steady. The deed was stored in a plastic envelope inside the bedroom closet, next to Dot's photo, exactly where he had decided to keep it when he got home. He didn't need to look at it to know it was there. He only needed to know it was. And it was. The end of the story. Now tell us what you thought of this story that touched so many hearts. Do you believe that Mr. Arthur's calmness is the greatest strength a person can have? Leave your opinion in the comments, hit like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.